Okay, so let's get on to tonight, and I'll introduce the host for this evening. Toronto Public Library Writer-in-Residence Marina Endicott. Marina has published novels, short fiction, and plays, and she's been a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Award and the Governor-General's Literary Award, among other honors. Her most recent novel, The Little Shadows, tells the story of three sisters in the world of vaudeville during the First World War. And during her residency here at the library, she is researching her next work of historical fiction, which will be called The Difference. And she will also be sharing what she's learned about the process through workshops and one-on-one meetings with aspiring writers, and of course, events like this. So please welcome Marina Endicott, and the others come on up.
I'm very happy to welcome you all to the Toronto Reference Library for this celebration of the act of bravery contained in writing and reading. In The Cellist of Sarajevo, Stephen Galloway's character Keenan is particularly disturbed by the destruction of the National Library, the most visible manifestation of a society he was proud of, which for him represents basic civilization. I'm going to just outline the controversy in brief, since that is what we're talking about. The real Sarajevan cellist, Vedran Smailović, took issue with the publication of the book, which is named for him, after all, The Cellist of Sarajevo. The original Canadian cover used his photograph. How can somebody steal your work? My sadness, my tragedy, Smailović asked in an interview with the CBC. He threatened to burn his cello, along with a copy of Galloway's novel, and he demanded some financial recompense, which Galloway rightly refused, in my opinion. The suit did not progress, and Smailović's cello remained unburnt. Yet, was Smailović so wrong? I think Galloway might agree that the image of the cellist playing in the rubble is the springboard for the book, and for the understanding of that conflict that we might glean from reading the book. Even the publicity for the one-book program is all cello all the time. 22 cellos playing silently across Toronto. Cellos aside, though, this question continues to plague writers. How do we work from our material, which is always real life, without infringing the rights and the privacy of others? The three writers we've gathered for you tonight have all written about real people in their fiction. Greg Hollingsworth, whose book Bedlam follows James Tilly Matthews, an escapee from the famous London madhouse in 1797, is one of Canada's most illustrious writers. He has won the Governor-General's Award, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. Bedlam was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. Greg directs the writing studios at Banff and has recently moved to Toronto. Are you wearing your Order of Canada pin?
No. No.
He's wearing it silently. Helen Humphreys, whose novel Afterimage was inspired by the life of Victorian photographer Julia Cameron, although she assures me she did not write about Julia Cameron. That book won the Rogers Writers Trust for fiction. All Helen's novels are remarkable. Her most recent book, Nocturne, is a memoir of her brother's life. But memoir is constructed to deal properly with real people, or at least to allow writers that illusion. Writing in the Globe and Mail, Zoe Whittle called Nocturne not merely a worthwhile addition to the ever-expanding genre of literary grief, but a lesson by example on how it should be done. Lastly, Nino Ricci, whose Lives of the Saints ushered in a tremendous career in Canada and internationally. The only person here who's had a character played by Sophia Loren, who has won the Trillium Prize and the Governor-General's Award twice, who has been writer-in-residence at the Toronto Public Library, and who had the temerity to write about Jesus in his novel Testament. So, phew. Okay, so talking about what she called the more restricted art of biography, Virginia Woolf said that the biographer must thank old friends and last but not least, Mrs. Jones, the widow, for that help without which this biography could not have been written. The novelist simply says in his foreword, every character in this book is fictitious. The novelist is free, the biographer is tied. So I wonder, you guys, as novelists, do you feel free? Or do you take advantage of that freedom even if you don't feel it, if you feel badly about it? free to make stuff up, Greg? When you were looking at Bedlam, did you invent things?
Well, there's history, and then there's family and friends. And I would say I definitely do not feel free when I'm writing about family and friends, because I don't want to hurt people.
Yeah.
And that's not an aesthetic issue. That's a moral or an emotional issue, personal issue. History. I think the problem with the whole notion of historical fiction, if I may say,
You may say.
if I may suggest, is that it's neither fish nor fowl. Like, it's a bastard, right? It's not. Is it history or is it fiction? Well, I guess that's why we're here. I guess that's why we're supposed to be walking the line. My difficulty, I think, writing historical fiction was that I came to the period as a scholar, and I probably had more commitment to the history than I should have. I think a fiction writer needs to be quite free with the facts. And I always was very conscious of when I was straying from the facts. And the facts aren't always the best for the story. Here's my example. I'll just stop when I say this. I think one of the most striking mistakes that Stephen made. No, I won't say it that way. I'll say it this way.
Stephen will forgive us for
He made
everything we say today.
I felt as a reader that he made a small error when he called that character Arrow, and because it seemed terribly corny to me. But I think he used it because it was the
Arrow is the sniper in the book.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So there you have it. There you have it. You know, I mean, they're two different realities. I mean, you know.
So you would have changed the name of the sniper, but you would have stuck with the cello.
I don't think the cellist. I think that's just a red herring. I think that's the cellist coming forward for his money, for his recognition and his money. I think that's what that was about. And I think that Stephen responded honorably in that entire kind of situation, because it became a situation.
Yeah. I think what you said about the aesthetic versus the moral and personal judgment is a really important one. We were talking before, and Helen and I, about how everybody has to make up their own rules for you sort of determine what your rules for how you will use historical figures, real people, friends and family will be. And it may be that that there is no one rule that will ever work. Helen, what's your rule? What have you worked out?
Well, it's easier if they're dead. I'll say that.
Yeah.
It's easier if they're dead, for all sorts of reasons. But I always just think that, well, history, there's so much what is the truth, right? That history is full of interpretation of things. You can know when a battle took place, and you can know who won that battle, but maybe that's all you'll know. That's this kind of truth that we think of as being the truth. So everything really is up for interpretation. And but what I try and do is that, given that I feel that way, I try and pick one thing out of what I'm writing about that I try and be faithful to when I'm writing about a historical person. So in the book After Image, which is based on Julia Margaret Cameron's photographs, I tried to be faithful to the photographs and the photographic process. So I learned everything I could about the process, and I used the real photographs that she took, and that was the point that I kind of attached myself to in that book. So in every book that I write that's set in the past, I choose one thing, and I feel that that's kind of the best that I can do, because I'm not going to be able to get it all right. But if I can get one thing, what I feel is mostly right, or in some ways emotionally right anyway, then that's the best I can do.
Picking the art makes sense to me too. I did the same thing with vaudeville. I used all kinds of people's lives, but I tried to make the actual acts absolutely accurate, exactly, as much as I could as they would have been. What about Jesus, for heaven's sakes? Literally.
I feel he's a bit of a red herring in that
9 red herrings, I think it was, wasn't it?
in a way, it's sort of the opposite process when you write about someone like Figure. We really don't know who the historical Jesus was, and although people of faith will claim that the Gospels give us that person, anyone who's done sort of an academic study of the Gospels can easily point to the fact that these are works of art, that they follow certain rules of plot, of genre, that they follow the standard hero stories of the day, that Alexander the Great had a similar kind of hero story. Augustus, also rose up to heaven at his death. The virgin birth was a common motif in hero stories, and so on. And the textual record seems to show that there probably was a guy named Jesus who said some things, and at a certain point, some writers who had never met him decided if this religion is going to work, we have to have a sales pitch. We have to have a good story to go, with the
Cohesive story, one that we can all agree on.
And part of what I was trying to do in Testament was to try and imagine who a real figure might have been who stood behind that myth. But the materials at our disposal are minimal, and no one can really challenge my version of things because there's so much that we can never know. And I think this is a question that comes up in any historical work, that you always have to be asking the question, what can we know, and how can we rely on any version of the truth? And one of the things that always strikes me about any book of history is how much less truthful it can be than a work of fiction, because it cannot assume what people were thinking. It cannot know the most important things. They must be left out because they were not recorded. And when you look at how the historical record even gets preserved. I was reading an article the other day where someone was taking apart a mummy and discovered there pages of a 4th century BC text from a Greek playwright that was unknown until that moment, had not existed in history. Now they had 3/4 of this, or the segments of ancient history that have been preserved in those way as palimpsests because they were written over by monks and so on. So we can assume that 90% or 95% of the historical record is missing. And if we did not supplement what is there with what we can imagine, it would be very hard to enter into the historical truth of a period. I think there was a German whose name I believe was Herder, who talks about that, how you enter into the historical spirit of a period. And this is what I try to do what I tried to do in my Jesus book. The book I'm working on now, the main character is a Roman historian. I try to learn enough that I feel I can make that leap, that I have some sense of the truth of that world, and then go from there.
So you can enter into the history properly, and you're not then going to be manipulating the characters into your own world, but staying within the historical possibilities that they had at the time?
You will, yes. It's a fool's errand. You will always, back in 1909, Albert Schweitzer wrote a book about the search for the historical Jesus. In 1909, there had already been hundreds of attempts, and the conclusion he came to is that every era came up with their own Jesus.
Which was remarkably like their own. It's like the God fish of Rupert Brooks's poem. Fish God who looks a lot like a fish.
Yeah. So we're inevitably going to do that, but at the same time, we make the attempt. We hope to recover something that expands our own sense of our humanity.
So
Yeah.
Somebody said, and this is, somebody said that you do your research until you can hear their voices in your head. I like that.
Yeah.
That's what you do, until you can hear those characters. And then you can start writing. But until then, you know, you're taking in this stuff, and you can only hope that there's going to be space for you to enter in, that it's not all going to be documented. The story will have gaps, and that's where you go, as you're saying.
Well, and part of that entering in, Greg, you once talked about the comic romp pastiche tone that historical fiction can sometimes take. You were quoting Sherry Holman's The Dress Lodger. On a 19th century barman who sweetens his wine with lead, he knows he stands a chance of poisoning half his clientele, but most drink beer so he doesn't sweat it. So Greg
Really
said...
annoying. Really, really annoying.
I know, it drives me so crazy. I guess in my own system of rules, the language is one of the most important things to me. So Greg, you said, I wanted something more likely, not so 18th century that it would put readers off, but 18th century enough that they would never think, that doesn't sound very 18th century. So what I did was an original impression of an 18th century style. So did you go about that by immersing yourself in the writing of the period? What was your task there, and how did you achieve it?
Well, first, I was very reluctant to be writing something that historical at all, because it's a long time ago. And my own experience of historical fiction is that it's filled with furniture, you know, furniture, like all that crap, all that stuff that gets foregrounded. The research gets in the way of the story. It's like fiction's dramatic, and it's about this. It's about how people kind of connect or fail to connect with each other. But you get too much furniture, and it's looking that way, like it's looking perpendicular rather than this way. And or you get, it's the same if you have too many ideas, you're looking that way instead of this way. So it has a real kind of difficulty about it, you know, historical fiction. Aside from all the expectations of romance and all that stuff, the more generic expectation. I mean, you know, romance, capital R, the generic.
Treasure Island, you mean, rather than.
So my idea was to get into it through the language, like make the language communicate the time rather than the furniture, and like, you know, keep it back, cut any kind of furniture back. Just get the language right.
It's true. That book is almost empty. The rooms are empty of furniture. When I think back.
It was I'll tell you what was very instructive. Part of my research was reading Bleak House, because I thought, well, there is a historical novel with a very strong kind of atmosphere to it. And I read that, and I don't know if you'll have the same experience, but you get past the first 15 pages, and it's dialogue. I mean, all the furniture, as it were, is created in the first 15 pages of that. What is it? 500-page book.
800, I bet.
Okay, but it's, you know, like it's dramatic, but he gets what he needs. He establishes. It's like, you know, what are they called? Tuning fork? No, yeah, pitch pipe. That's it. Pitch pipe. You get that right,
It's in tune.
You go with it.
There's that lovely thing about talking about characters being got in. When you just mention somebody's red face leering into the room. I can't remember what the actual quote is. But that you create that and then you just ignore it. It's a bit, in theater, when people are rehearsing, they rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and they learn and learn and learn and learn stuff, and they work on character, and they do all this background, you know, previous circumstances and what people were like ever since they were born, and et cetera. And then you get on stage and you have to just let all that go and do the work that's this kind of stuff.
And I think, I mean, you're getting at something I think is true generally of fiction, that it works best when you just find the one telling detail that does all that work.
Gets it in.
If you spend the whole time describing, yes, every bloody piece of furniture, then the story just stops dead. But you just find the one thing that establishes the scene. And I think that's true in terms of historical language as well. I mean, you find this with, when you have a character who speaks with an accent. If you try to write that in sort of a transliterated way, it just becomes so distracting and heavy-handed and demeaning of the character. Often the best thing is to use, perfectly grammatical English, but find like the one syntactical shift that someone like a German speaker would make when speaking English.
The verb at the end of the sentence.
Yeah, which brings it home immediately and takes away all that sort of distracting furniture, as you say. And I think that's true also in terms of, creating a language for a different time. You have to find maybe those few aspects that will bring home that sense of difference without the reader having to think with every line, because that becomes distorting in itself. Because at the time, people were speaking in the idiom that sounded to them the way our idiom sounds to us.
Invisible.
It didn't sound like 17th century English or like, Old Testament.
Old Testament. New Testament.
Hebrew. Or it was still old at the time. Nobody had written the new one.
Helen, in Coventry, it seemed to me that you caught that real sense of the ordinary life of the wartime England so well. What did you do towards that? Did you have a strategy, or did you just steep yourself in it?
I always have a strategy, sometimes to my detriment. But that book came out. I wanted to write something about the Iraq War, which was going on at the time. And I was reading a lot of eyewitness accounts of the Baghdad bombing. And I decided I would write about that war by writing about another war. And so I picked Coventry because it was a city that fell in one night. So I liked the idea of setting a novel in one night of bombing, which when I thought it up was an excellent idea. And then as I went to work on the novel, it was just the worst thing, because night is dark and bombing is loud. So my characters couldn't really talk, and I had to keep throwing them in holes or behind walls so they could have a conversation. Yeah, and then getting them to go up again. But so it was a nightmare, and I rewrote that book so many times. But when I first thought of it, I was very pleased. And what I wanted to do with that book was to use the eyewitness accounts of the night, because that's where I had started in my idea. And so I used the real details of the bombing and how it occurred, and hour by hour what happened in the city. So all of those details are factually based and based on eyewitness accounts of that night.
I'm so interested in the whole eyewitness account thing too, because I think that it's just, for me, researching what I need, it's always those letters and journals that are the most useful when people are writing about what happened during it happening. So you didn't have many of those Aramaic letters to go on.
Yeah.
But what did you do to? Did you read in the New Yorker a long time ago? Somebody wrote a diary of Jesus' girlfriend. I'll find it for you. It's pretty priceless.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, people were writing at the time. There was a Jewish historian, Josephus, who wrote extensively about that era and who lived in that era, and who's, he was a great source.
What was he writing about? I went down to the market and got some fish, and my wife didn't want to cook it. She said it was not good enough.
But there were Roman writers who were doing that. Yeah. Mind you, it would have been a much different mindset. But one of the instructive books that I read was a book by James Michener called The Source, which is a book which all takes place on this one hill in Israel that has about 7,000 years of history in it. And there are many of these tells in the Middle East that function that way archaeologically. And one of the great points that the book makes is that in any given era, you can find 4,000 or 5,000 years of history. You can go today and see the span of the different ways in which humans have lived across time, just by visiting different cultures and different countries. And I think I had some sense of that from my own experience that I brought to Testament, through the peasant culture of my parents, for instance. I found that quite a good entry point into the peasant culture of Galilee. Through a couple of years I spent living in Nigeria, in a village in Nigeria. And that gave me a way to transpose my own experience into sort of daily life in that kind of village, isolated environment. The kind of syncretic attitude toward religion that I found, for instance, in Nigeria, where there were Christian beliefs, but there were animistic beliefs. There was this whole melding of different systems.
As there must have been.
It would have been very true of Galilee in the first century, from all the historical records that we have. So it's not. There are always avenues that you can find to enter into that daily life.
I would like to ask you, each of you, if you found, when you were doing your examination of whichever book you want to talk about, whether you found that there were, things that really rang your tuning fork yourself. Did you pick to write about Bedlam and that era because it had some resonance for you in some way? And also Julia Margaret Cameron, and of course, also, Lives of the Saints too. Was there something that you didn't even know when you started writing that you needed to write about it because it was like something you understood, had some resonance for your own life? Did you get surprised by that? Or did you know from the start that your life is Bedlam, and so? No, of course.
No, what got me started on Bedlam was reading a case history by Haslam, my doctor. My Bedlam has three characters: the madman and his doctor and the madman's wife. And it was reading. This is the first sort of full-length case history, medical case, psychiatric case history in English, written by the doctor about the madman. And it's a very strange document. The tone is very odd, because he's essentially saying, look, this guy is nuts. He's really nuts. But there was a kind of intimacy and almost a kind of affection in it as well. And that was my way in, because I thought, what's going on? And what turned out to be going on was the doctor wrote this in order to justify his holding a madman against the law, because he wasn't a danger to anybody, but it was for political reasons. And the doctor was simply doing it in order to keep his job. So hence this odd tone. It was like betraying a friend in a case history.
And so the case history being a kind of fiction. He was constructing a mad history in order to justify.
Yeah. And his voice was coming through, and the madman's voice was coming through very clearly, because he was resonating. It was resonating with something in the doctor. So that was just so rich, boy.
What about?
Hold myself back.
That's always good when you can't hold yourself back. What about Julia Margaret Cameron?
Well, a lot of my books begin with a question or something quite simple usually, and that book began because I had seen a exhibition of photographs at the AGO that Cameron had taken of her maid, Mary Hillier, dressed as the Virgin Mary, and I went to see it, and I thought, how odd to be Mary Hillier, to be the Virgin Mary. She had to remain in costume all through the day. She had to go to the village dressed as the Virgin Mary, and yet she was still the maid in the house. And so I thought,
she had to do her work while wearing it.
So I thought, what was it like to be her, and what was that relationship like? With that, the maid being the muse, essentially, right, for the lady of the house, and yet still being a servant. And so I wanted to write about that relationship, and it started from there. And most of my books kind of come from that place. I was thinking of the one of my novels that is the most historically based is The Reinvention of Love, which is based on Charles Sainte-Beuve, who was a minor poet and literary critic, and Victor Hugo, who was once his best friend until he had an affair with Adele Hugo, who was Victor Hugo's wife. And it's about the three of them. And it was I started reading some of Charles's writings, and he was very, very funny. And he was worried about the same kind of petty literary jealousy that we're worried about as writers now. So he was very easy to relate to him and how his book wasn't selling, and he just went around to the bookstores to move it to the front, the same things that so it just, so I immediately connected with him, even though he was, 200 and something years ago. It felt very current and very familiar.
I love that feeling of currency, of it being people you understand in some way, which for me seems to be the beginning of the 20th century over and over again. I don't know why. What about Jesus?
Jesus?
Why? Are you
Well,
that good?
I mean, I think every Catholic boy wants to be Jesus.
Of course. Every girl, too, I'm sure.
Yeah. And, there was a period when I thought it was a possibility. You didn't know.
It still is. It still is.
At age 5 or 6, what could happen? He was just, he was sort of my superhero. As a kid, the first book I owned was a picture Bible called The Guiding Light, and it was probably the first book I read cover to cover. And they're very potent stories. They're very rich. They're evocative. I mean, they've had a lot of staying power, clearly. Yeah. And
they were constructed that way.
Yeah, exactly. And it was, deeply embedded in my imagination, and I think helped structure my imagination. I can see it in all of my books. So it was just a way of going back to the source. And it also seemed to me that, culturally, here's this figure, Jesus, who we don't really ever talk about, even though he has influenced, a good 3/4 of the world's population in deep, deep ways. And he's influenced, so much of our morality and our culture and our art and our books. And yet nobody really talks about him in a cultural way. He just remains the property of the churches, and in particular of the born-again churches, because the more traditional churches don't talk about him either, because it's just kind of awkward to talk about, because the story's a bit weird.
Kept doing things that we don't
like
loving the poor.
Yeah. So it just seemed to me an interesting and important cultural job also, just to look at him a little more closely and see what's there.
That's so good about the illustrated Bible you had. I'm staying with my parents while I'm doing this residency, and my mother just found the book that I first had, and she brought it to me today to tell me that I knew every word of it, and it was When Jesus Came to My House.
There you go.
And it's funny because my book, Good to a Fault, is basically a retelling of When Jesus Came to My House. If you go back and look, it's exactly what it is. I want to talk, we were talking about historical figures and people that, are usually long dead. But I also want to know about what your rules or your thinking is about writing about people that you know. Anne Lamott, the writing teacher, famously adjured writers to tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better. So I wonder if for you guys there is a distinction in historical fiction, as there might be seen to be in contemporary fiction, between our own stories and those that somehow belong to other people in some way. Is there a single set of rules about writing about other people? If there is that rule about historical figures, does it also apply to people we know? Do the same rules apply to my sister as to Sister Mary Magdalene? Or is there a different set of rules? Is there a rule? No, there's no rule. But what do you do?
There's no rule. I think I don't want to hurt people.
Yeah.
I don't want to hurt people.
That's a good rule.
I remember I was at Wayne Johnston, who's famously free with his history, the writer, was at a reading he was doing in Edmonton, and a woman was in the audience who, I think her mother was, a character in his book was based on the woman's mother, and the woman sort of confronted him with this. And he said, I don't give a shit. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter. I'm a fiction writer. I don't care if I got your mother's facts wrong. It doesn't matter. That seemed a little harsh, because the woman is standing
Right there.
right there in the room. I mean, there is where, there's where the two come together. When my father, shortly before he died, began to write his memoir, and when he came to the point, he did his childhood, he got about 15,000 words. When he came to the day he met my mother, he couldn't write anymore.
He was too verklempt.
Well, he realized she would read it. And I said, well, try dictating. But I sort of feel that way. It's not just that you don't want to hurt people, but you kind of, these people, you internalize your friends and family, and they're kind of looking over your shoulder, and they're constraining me anyway, constraining me. And then can I just find
tell
the
one.
Alice Munro thing?
Yes.
She complained that people, you try to change things so people won't take offense, and they blame you for getting it wrong.
Or they think
Can't
they're
win.
somebody they're not. Do you have a rule?
I don't know. I don't.
Whatever you can get away with?
No, not that either. I I don't really have a rule, but I think, like Greg, I don't want to hurt people, and I don't want to presume, about things that aren't my business. I wrote about my brother. He had died, and so I wrote about. We were close, and I had known him all of my life. So, no, all of his life, not all of my life. So I wrote, I was honest in that book, and I wrote things, but it's from my perspective, and there are still secrets of his I kept that I know that he wouldn't want me to disclose, and so I tried to, think what he would not like, but not mind, I guess, right? That if he read that book, even though I'm sure he would argue with me over parts of it, that he wouldn't actually mind it.
I think that's maybe why there can't be a rule, because for your brother, there would be certain things that he would mind and other things he wouldn't. For my mother, there would be other things. For, writing about your neighbor when you were 12, there would be things you would hesitate to presume, and yet other things you would feel quite free about.
I guess it's if you want to preserve those relationships or not, right? If you want to, like, if you don't care about preserving those relationships, you could write about people and say whatever you want. But if these are ongoing relationships or people who are important to you or you want to continue with them, I think you have.
Even if the person is not there anymore.
Yeah, that's right.
I wrote about my sister a lot, who had also died, and there were things I didn't write because it seemed wrong. Not that I could even identify necessarily why it felt like a trespass.
But this is in where you're saying it's nonfiction.
I was saying it was fiction.
Okay. Because I think the point that Greg makes, that people, if they see one thing that is familiar, then they assume that you mean it all to be about them. But the point is that it's fiction. So you inevitably, as a writer, take all kinds of details from the
Patchworks
familiar.
from different people, too.
And
Sticking one guy's mustache on another guy's knees.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then people say, you got it wrong. Alice Munro has a great essay called, I think, What is Real, or something like that, where she talks about how she writes a story and how people ask her, well, why did you have to put in that true thing, that thing that actually happened? And she describes it as a kind of starter dough. So she says most of her stories do have something that comes from the world. And I feel that when I write. And often it's the thing that I think, I really don't want to put that in. So-and-so is going to see that and know. But then once I've thought it's like the
Already
cornerstone.
Yeah.
The whole structure seems in danger of crumbling if I take it out.
And sometimes it's a thing about
gives-
yourself, in fact, that you don't want to write about. And yet,
Well, often, exactly.
There it is.
And I think it's partly because, as a fiction writer, you're inventing so much. If you don't have that one touchstone, you can say, this is something I saw and I felt and I know and it's real. I can put this in and I can build the house around it. If that thing isn't there, it becomes hard to have faith in the rest. So it has happened to me that I've put in details like that probably haven't been well received And I've noticed sometimes in my family, they will mention
Your family
little
always will.
things, yeah, that they might have preferred not to be there, but it would have been hard for me to leave them out.
And I think those are the things that you can go back to as you continue to write, as touchstones, as to, work backwards. If you've come to something false, you can work backward to that thing you know and work forward again. You were about to speak. I think.
I was just, some details are just irreplaceable.
Yeah.
A friend told me a story about, you crush the pennies on the
Yeah, on the
track,
rail.
and he was doing it with a friend, and they crushed, I think, 3 pennies successfully. And then later the same afternoon, my friend was saved from drowning by the guy he was doing that with. And the guy who saved his life asked him if he could have one of the pennies. And my friend said no. I didn't want to take it, but I mean, how do you how do you find something to replace that?
I know.
Yeah, you just have to use
Do
it.
you use snails instead of pennies?
So I used it, and he sent me a bill. He sent me a bill. He charged me $1.29 for the use of it. I didn't pay it. But
I was going to ask about that, if anybody had ever paid. I myself have paid for lines many times. I used to work with comics, and if you use another comic's joke, they say, well, you owe me $5, or I'll give you $5. I'm writing about teenagers right now, and my children are out, my teenage children are in the front hall with their friends talking, and I'm typing quietly in my office, just writing down stuff they say. And a couple of them I have actually mentioned that I'm using it because they'd know. So I have a little stack of $5 bills to give out if they want them. But it's a slippery slope.
It is.
Don't try paying Jesus. I think we have to stop and go to questions. Do we have any questions from the floor? While you're thinking about that, we'll get you to go over to the microphone so that we can have the questions loudly enough for everybody to hear.
there was a hand, but
It was a hand, yes. Can I get you to go to the microphone to ask your question? There's always this, you can use this little lull to think about your very brilliant question to ask our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Hi. When an author is writing historical fiction, where most or very much of the novel is based on real historical figures, considering that many people who read it are learning history from the novel, does the novelist have any kind of responsibility to let the people know what is or who is real and who is not real?
So, what is our responsibility to history, and must we footnote it, I guess, to let
Particularly
people know,
when it's a well-known book or...
so which people are real and which people aren't, perhaps? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, considering that many people who read it are learning history.
So if they're looking to learn from the book, they'll take the whole thing as history, and maybe we should say, I made up Miss Plum because I needed a sexy secretary?
Well, I think that's probably an individual choice, as well. But in my case, what I try and do is I put in an author's note, usually somewhere at the end, and I say what is real. And if I've based something on something else, I'll say what it is. So I give that information at the end of the book, usually.
Or sometimes people will put it at the beginning. you
Yeah.
know. But I think that more and more is becoming a website thing, too. People will sometimes have quite elaborate websites describing what parts of their fiction came from where. And have you ever bothered to say what's what?
Well, I certainly with Testament, I had an essay about that, but I think in some ways it's incumbent on the reader to assume if they're reading a novel that they should not trust anything at face value, and that they need to test, and that the novel may in fact be playing against that. I mean, one of the books I read recently was The Savage Detectives, which invents this whole literary movement in Mexico in the 20s. And I mean, it'd be very easy to read that book and think of it as history, but a lot of what the book is doing is really questioning the way in which we construct history and how we construct literary history and so on. So I don't think the writer has to give away their game and say, I'm just playing with you. The writer often is trying to make you think about exactly those questions. I know that a recent book by Peter Carey, which plays with the history of Alex de Tocqueville, the French historian, and radically changes all sorts of aspects of his life to the extent that historians are sort of up in arms. But his point is that in doing so, he thinks he's arrived at a greater truth about him than historians have pointed at. So each book will have its own rules and its own intentions in how it uses history. And I don't think there is any set rule. It all depends on what that book is trying to do. And part of what it may be trying to do is force you to think about the ways in which it's using history.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question for all four of you. Like all of you have mentioned, that it's up to the person writing and reading how much they take from a real person or a real incident and how much they embellish it with fiction. How do you sort of attain that balance, for instance, if you're writing, let's say, satire, where you want your reader to recognize the character that is based on someone, but because it's a satirized version of it, so you sort of, you take like liberties with it?
Sorry, you're taking liberties with, I missed a word in there, desire?
Satire.
Satire.
So basically, if a character is based on a real person and you're writing a satire, so you want your readers to recognize that character, that it's based on that character, but obviously because it's a satire,
you don't want
change
Harper to
names
sue
or
you.
something.
Yeah.
So like how is that ethically correct? Can you actually do it, or like there are like, I don't know, copyright issues, or if you have to do it, for instance, like I don't know how do we go about it?
I always thought, naively, that there was like a lawyer who would look at your stuff. But I find that's not the case. The publisher seems to expect you to have done that work and figured out whether you're going to get sued or not. Anybody care to just jump out on a limb with that one? I think if it's political satire, there are sort of Roman à clef kind of understood ways that that's done. Like 22 Minutes does it all the time.
And it's actually a defense. It's a defense under copyright that you can satirize something and use it.
Right.
But if you're doing it in a satirical way, it frees you from copyright.
So Frank Magazine can exist again by saying they're just satirizing people. They get sued all the time, but they don't often lose.
But yes, and if you're satirizing a public figure, that also gives you leeway in terms of libel and that kind of possible
We're all so worried.
defense. But
We don't want to talk about it, really.
we don't think about it much.
No, I was thinking
Just
about
right.
it because I wrote a long piece on Harper, and I was worried for a while because it's quite scurrilous, the piece. And I didn't name him, finally. I didn't name him. I didn't need to. You know? I didn't need
Scurrilous as it was.
I don't need to with that guy. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's anything to worry about. On the other hand, some of these guys are really litigious.
Yeah. In the US, it's much harder to sue anyone for any kind. If you're a public figure in any sense, you essentially cannot be sued unless you are intentionally malicious and deceitful. But even if you get facts wrong, unless there's active malice, you can't be sued. But in Canada, it's a bit trickier in that regard. And someone like Conrad Black has controlled a lot of the discourse about him because he's so litigious. and sues anyone who mentions him in the least context.
And that's exhausting. You just don't want to be spending 7 years of your life being sued by Conrad Black. Write about somebody else.
No.
We may be in danger even now.
We probably are.
It's being recorded. It's
Right.
Put Albinoni's Adagio over this.
silent.
Silent adagio, that's right.
Silence would do too. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Roger. My question is, how minimal does fiction have to be and still be fiction? If you have a strong personal story to tell, is it enough to change the names and it still be fiction? Or do you have to lie a little bit and sacrifice the truth of your story?
There are many, how strong does fiction, how do you make it fiction? There are lots of examples of novels where the character is, Carl Sagan, and it's written by Carl Sagan. I can't think of who I'm trying to think of right now. A couple of recent novels. Jonathan Safran Foer, I think, has a novel where it's a guy called Jonathan. Tim O'Brien, over and over again, yeah. I mean, I think James Salter, all of his characters could be named James Salter. Many people.
That doesn't mean that it's autobiographical.
Exactly, and it doesn't mean it's not fiction, even if it is autobiographical. It can still be fiction.
Well, the moment you start to write something down, you make a story of it. So you, in a sense, you've fictionalized it, you know.
This is why I think memoir is way harder, because as soon as I start to write something down, if I try to write something true, it goes all false.
Because it becomes the story.
Yeah.
So it is false at that point, really, I guess, in a way.
But how, I didn't, how, what's the question exactly?
Were you asking because
Thinly
you have an
veiled.
ulterior motive that you would like to write a story about yourself, but you'd like nobody to know that it was you? Not to put you on the spot.
If you're interested as a writer in telling your own story in a way, but you can't tell it directly, and feel that you do need to cover pieces of it, or maybe a lot of it, I don't know, but I am trying to speak to the theme of the evening.
Absolutely.
I always approach that kind of concern from the point of view of what's easier to write. How is it easier for you to write that material? It's like you may find, I mean, I talked earlier about the constraints that your internalized family and friends impose, or can, possibly. But I think it's sort of like the question of, what person should I use? Should this be third person or first person? And I think that's often a question really about what works best for you as the writer of this narrative. What works best?
What makes it even possible?
What enables you to get at what feels like that is most true about this material? I mean, there's a sense in which when you start to write, you become you're not inside your ego anymore. You're kind of, you're an artist, and you're making something out of it that will communicate. So the question is, so how do you work on your strengths, and what will get you into the best parts of the thing? And you don't know until you try.
Difficult to communicate, and then you move toward fiction, and at what point are you making too great a compromise?
It could be that the fictional version is truer to your story. It could be. It's what Nino was saying earlier about, it could be. You know what I'm saying? we're talking about, we're not just talking about sort of what happened, we're talking about the truth, the significance of what happened. And it could be that, you know, rearranging that narrative gets at the significance more successfully.
You could always, you know, just write it down, right? Like write what feels like the truest thing for you to write, and just don't worry about what that is. Write it down till it's down, because you can fix endlessly, right? You can edit endlessly. You can work on
Change the names.
Yeah, you can work on the narrative later. But if you get something down initially, it's easier to then go and do that work and shape it and worry about those things then, rather than when you start out, when you're sort of limiting yourself before you even begin. Like, better to just kind of plunge in and write something and keep it private if you need to, but then work on it again later.
Good advice. Another question?
Well, I have a comment first, and that is what I enjoy about historical fiction that I read is not so much the facts, is the atmosphere of being there. When you read
Transport.
a history book with all the footnotes and bibliography and everything, you don't really feel like being there. With historical fiction, well written, you are there, you're on the roof of Coventry Cathedral, you're in the trenches of the First World War, that kind of thing. And that's what I love about the fiction. It's not the facts. I can go elsewhere for the facts. But my question is, I've never written a book, but from what I gather from other events like this, writers either plan out the story ahead of time, or they get some idea, maybe a character, what have you, and just go for it. And I just wondered, what's it like writing historical fiction? Do you have to have it planned out ahead of time, and how do you go about it? Thank you.
Oh, we're going to have to stay all night. Are you planners or are you jumpers?
Well, I've done both, I guess. I've done where I've heavily researched before I've begun, and I've made a big plan and worked that way. And then I've done books where I haven't actually researched all that much, and I research as I go along, or I research more in the
Or both?
in the next, or both. Yeah, it sort of depends on the project or how soon I want to.
Well, for example, with
writing.
Coventry, with that one night of bombing, you had the historical record of the bombs, and whether you liked it or not, the bombs kept falling, and you had to kind of stick to that.
That's right. But I had that problem I mentioned, which I required 13 drafts of rewriting, where I had to move my characters around the city and have them say something to each other. So
God, that's
initially, it was a very internal novel. I didn't speak at all.
really.
They
You could just keep thinking about it at night in bed. It would be so beautiful. What about?
Well, I mean, I think it's often the case you don't know the book that you're writing until you've written it.
Yeah.
And usually when I try planning, it doesn't go well. It ends up limiting the work rather than helping it, because the first things I think of are always the most stereotypical and the most knee-jerk. And it's only when I get into the material that I start seeing the layers beneath it, and it starts taking me into places that I wouldn't have thought of if I just sat there for a day and thought, okay, I'm going to write book X. But when you've spent, 3 months or 6 months or 2 years with this material, you suddenly know it so much more intimately. And instead of going for the obvious, you see that sort of little back door that you can go through that leads to this entirely different place you wouldn't have known about until you'd done those 2 years of work. And some of which is research, and some of which is thinking, and some of which is just entering into that emotionally, and some of it is just living with that material in your head and having it come together, at the back of your mind, in your subconscious, in a way that you couldn't have plotted out through.
Which is probably what creates that sense of being transported to the time.
Can I just respond? I did respond to the first part of what you said, because I know with Bedlam, before I could write it, there was this business about needing to hear the voices, but I was in the fortunate position of being able to find out exactly what that hospital was like at the end of the 18th century. because all the material is still extant. You know, and before I could begin writing, I had to know exactly, you know, how big the cells were, and what the wainscoting was made of, and how high the windows were, and where they looked. You know, what the grounds were like. As many pictures as I could. I just had to inhabit that space before I could start writing. And I think place is always, and setting is always very important for novels in particular. I don't think it's just me. I think you kind of need that. And with history, if it's done well, you really get that. You get to go there and live there in your mind, which can be such a pleasure. I mean, it's a pleasure even to live for 5 years in Bethlehem Hospital in the 18th century.
Maybe more of a pleasure now than it would have been then. Another question.
Yes, excuse me. You've sort of answered my questions already, or you've answered my question in bits and pieces, but I'm wondering about how long you actually walk around with the main character in your head, and how that develops for you. Does it develop? Some of you have said it develops in the writing, but I wonder if there's a period before you ever write when you're just almost living with whoever that historical character is.
Do you live with your people before you write, during the writing, long after you've finished writing and it's been remaindered?
Yes.
Funny how quick they go.
I think, yeah.
Once they're out the door.
Well, I know they go afterwards. I'm talking about before.
I'll spend like 5, 10, 15 years thinking about a book and its characters before
Incubating.
I write it. But it's true, once it's done, they're gone.
Yeah, and all that research too, I think.
I think it's like being an actor. It's like being a very, very slow actor.
Uh-huh.
And
Getting to know the role, yeah.
well, my experience is that the book is finished, and all these characters leave your head, and they leave you empty. They leave you, you know, that Peter Sellers kind of thing. That, yeah, you're just empty. You're just a shell. They've all departed. They do leave quickly, don't they?
Yeah.
And they're very
Wait to
much
get out of there.
there while you're writing. They're very much there. Yeah. As for, they slowly evolve. They certainly grow with the writing. The
Yeah.
story, obviously.
For me too, they're always there, sort of pre-research, and then from that moment on, I guess.
You get to know them so much better than you know any of your friends and your family, actually.
I wanted to add one comment about people recognizing themselves. When David French first wrote Leaving Home, which was largely about his father and presented a picture of his father which wasn't entirely flattering, he was desperately worried about what his father would think when he came to see the play. And his father thought that character who he was seeing there was just the best guy that he ever could imagine.
I know so many people like that, including me. My mother just always thinks she's the other person. Lynn Cody, too, writes about her father a lot, who never recognizes it. Yes.
This is sort of in response to Nino when he said something about, along the lines of buyer beware, about not necessarily believing anything about historical figures that are named. And it makes me feel incredibly naive, because I kind of assumed, like in Lacuna, when Barbara Kingsolver talks about Diego Rivera, he's one of the characters that she researched it, and she was trying to, she was assuming that we knew a bit about him, and she was fleshing it out. Or in one of the recent books by William Boyd, the protagonist meets with Stalin and then meets with Brezhnev. And here I am thinking, oh, this is all so interesting. And now you make me feel kind of naive for thinking that I bought this and you're just pulling the wool over my eyes. But if that's in fact the case, then my question is, why would an author deliberately reference a historical figure that we're all familiar with if, in fact, they're not telling us anything that's based on truth? Well,
based on truth or based on fact? It's like that Peter Carey novel I referred to, he thinks he's getting at a truth about Alex de Tocqueville, but the facts are all wrong. So every author will set a different task. I don't know in any given historical novel why an author has referenced a historical figure. It might be simply to give what he thinks is his version. I mean, you can't talk about accurate. You can no more trust a nonfiction writer on Stalin than you can trust a fiction writer. They're only picking certain details, and they will always give you a partial portrait. But I don't know what his intention is in that book. So you should always, I think, carry that question in your head. What is he trying to do? How is he using this? How is he making this fit in his story? Clearly, he's telling a story. Things don't happen in the way they happen in fiction. Fiction is always sort of molding things to move toward a certain end. So I think it's always a good instinct to...
Well, I understand that writing is in the editing and what you are not saying, and that therefore nothing is ever the complete and whole truth. But I still find it a deliberate action for an author to include a real figure. So I'm just still
Do you think,
why they would.
And sometimes they expect you to take him straight, and sometimes they don't. So
every author
it's not going to be
differently, or would do it differently.
The book's not going to be labeled saying,
this is a trick. This is true. The writer may also feel very strongly that they are telling the absolute truth and yet be all wrong. I guess the best thing to do is just read 1,000 books.
A writer is always looking for common ground with the reader, and it's the same with conventions, using conventions. If you have a sense of generally what your reader's assumptions are going to be about something, then you have something to work with. And I think at some level, lots of writers are approaching historical figures that way. You know, we can assume there's certain things you know about Napoleon, and so that's your way in, and it's my way into writing about Napoleon. Then let's work with that. And as Nino says, I mean, that can go in all kinds of directions. But there's a lot of latitude because, well, as fiction writers, we really think that fiction has just as great a claim, if not a greater claim on truth than the historian when it comes down to character, which is what we're primarily interested in, as opposed to kind of historical fact. See, it's like a shared area of concern. Or if I want to write a story about abortion, I know right away that my readers are going to come to it with a set of assumptions and so on. So then I'll work with that. It's like that. It's like convention. It's like using conventions are readers' expectations. They're not rules for us. They're things that we can share with the reader and work with and against.
And maybe have a good time confounding.
Or simply pose, I mean, if I write about Hitler, I'm not going to get him right, but it's a way of posing the question of evil. And everyone will know that because we all have this shared memory of Hitler. So maybe what's more important is not how accurate my portrait of Hitler is, it's how I pose the question of evil. One of the points that Wayne Johnston makes is that, when Shakespeare was writing about Richard III, he wasn't writing about Richard III.
He didn't really know it.
It was not a historically accurate portrait. He was writing about a character who posed certain questions about what it means to be king.
And those questions were very apropos to Shakespeare's own politics, too.
Well, we assume, if there was a Shakespeare.
There was a Shakespeare. I've looked into it. I thank you very much for coming and talking to me tonight, and for all of us.